President Trump saying the U.S. and China are getting back to the negotiating table. That's bringing some optimism back to the markets. He did dial back his rhetoric against the Chinese at the G7 summit, saying trade negotiations are, in his words, much more meaningful than at any time.
The vice chairman of China, do you get higher than that other than President Xi? The vice president, the vice chairman, it's like the vice president, the vice chairman made the statement that he wants to make a deal, that he wants to see a calm atmosphere. He wants it all to happen. That's it.
Chinese trade officials have not confirmed the major progress that Trump cited, but Vice Premier Liu He did call for calm negotiations. Let's bring in Jim Roberts. He is a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a former State Department official. Jim, great to have you on today. It's been kind of a hectic 48 hours, you could say, the back and forth over at the G7. Even before that, on Friday, we heard the president calling on American companies to leave China. How much of this about face, at least in rhetoric that we saw from the president today, has to do with the big dip that we saw on Friday in the markets?
Well, probably quite a bit, although as your earlier segment covered, I think that you're going to still see more volatility going forward because the Trump administration has made it clear that any kind of meaningful agreement would have to have enforcement mechanisms that would require the U.S. to continue to hold tariffs over China to cajole them into living up to the agreement, and the Chinese have said that that's unacceptable. So I think we're still going to see some back and forth on this, but it is a good sign that the president has said that they want to go back to the table, and I think he probably heard that from the other G7 countries. They've all kind of suffered some collateral damage from China upending the world trade system and the U.S. Really taking the lead in confronting China. And President Trump really is finding it lonely at the top. And certainly the tariffs are not the preferred solution. The sooner the tariffs can end, the better. But meanwhile, I think it's a good sign, at least for right now.
We got some insight into the mindset of President Trump today when he was asked about the back and forth where he stood. He said, "This is just the way I negotiate." You pointed to those enforcement mechanisms. Is that still the ultimate goal right now for the White House? Are they still looking for stricter rules on tech transfers, IP theft, and enforcement mechanisms? Or are we starting to see the White House maybe back off of that a bit?
I can't imagine that President Trump and Peter Navarro and the other sort of hardliners in the White House would have come this far and suffered as much damage as they have already in terms of public relations without getting something meaningful. And the only way you can get meaningful progress is by having strict enforcement directly with China, because China has learned to game the World Trade Organization, which has not lived up to its real potential in this case. I would think that you would have to have something going forward on the intellectual property theft, on tech transfer, on the cyber warfare, and other elements that the White House has complained about.
How big is that window for any kind of deal right now, you think, given what's happening politically on the U.S. side, given that the Chinese have October 1st, which is going to be a big national celebration over in China, marking the anniversary of the PRC. Where does that window stand right now?
Well, I think it's kind of a movable window, really. This is going to be going on for a long time, I'm afraid. It's going to be a big issue in the 2020 presidential election. Certainly, we all hope that some progress can be made and that tensions can be lowered, and that the very strong U.S. economy can continue to burst forth with the vigor it's shown the rest of the world. It's really, as you said, the U.S. consumers are really leading the whole world right now. So let's hope that we can make progress this fall, but let's also be realistic that the overall trade tensions between the U.S. and China are going to continue.
Jim, we've talked a lot about where that pain point is for the Chinese, given the deceleration in the economy. We've seen the data certainly turn downwards, and yet we haven't seen the Chinese leadership budge at all. Let me flip that question and ask you where you think the pain point is for the White House. At what point do they come to the table and say, maybe we're asking for a bit too much, or do you see that as a possibility at all?
Well, certainly, if some of the forecasts about how much the average family is going to end up paying in tariffs at the end of the day, if these continue at these high rates that have been threatened, that's really going to start to bite. It was quite interesting that the White House put off some of the tariffs that would have affected Christmas shopping. Already they have shown some realism there. So the pain point is maybe, medium term for the U.S., but certainly it must be short term for China. They have already having bank failures, and the Chinese are, very non-transparent about what's really the state of their economy. But clearly they're feeling the pressure even more than the United States.
And Jim, finally, let me go back to where we started, because this weekend, it did feel like there was a bit of a schizophrenic policy, if you will, if we're just basing this off of the public statements that came from President Trump and the tweets. We talk about what happened on Friday, the president ramping up his rhetoric, upping the amount of tariffs that are placed on Chinese goods coming in. And then we also heard him ordering American companies to leave China. We had the president this weekend saying that perhaps maybe he had some second thoughts, only to have the White House come out and say he had second thoughts about actually not going tougher on China. This negotiating tactic, has it worked at all for the White House?
Well, it's typical of President Trump to use bluster and kind of inflammatory language in tweets. In fact, he can't order U.S. companies to do anything unless he invokes the AIPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, which he hasn't done in this case. He'd have to declare an emergency. So I think a lot of this is just kind of for show and for kind of reaching his constituents to let them know in states that voted for him in 2016 that he's out there fighting for them. But how much of that he actually does is probably going to be a lot less than what his blustery tweets indicate.
Okay, Jim, good to get your insights today. Jim Roberts joining us from Heritage.